Welcome everyone to Sunday service. It's a joy to have you all the people from the village, all people from outer community, and also from the Expanding Light. I understand it was a Kriya Prep weekend, and many of you have taken Kriya. That's just a wonderful thing. Bless you all. My name is Seva Weberg, and this is Peter Van Houten. And so I will read from Rays of the One Light. Is God present even there where there is ignorance? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. The Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, makes a reference to the divine light that is obscure to the rational facility, but that enlightens our higher nature. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Reason recoils from this statement with innumerable questions. What is this darkness? Is it conscious that it should comprehend anything? What sort of light would be capable of shining in darkness without transforming at least that part of the darkness in which it shines into light? Does this light shine only at night? And if so, why only then? The solution is that to divine sight, even daylight seems darkness. The sun itself, like the moon, which shines only by reflected light from the sun, is but a kind of reflection of the cosmic light, which being immaterial is invisible to the eyes, but which is the great source of all material reality. In the autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda describes his youthful visit to Ram Gopal Muzumdar, the sleepless saint, who lived in the vision of that hidden light. Around midnight, Yogananda wrote, Ram Gopal fell into silence, and I lay down on my blankets. Closing my eyes, I saw flashes of lightning. The vast space within me was a chamber of molten light. I opened my eyes and observed the same dazzling radiance. The room became a part of the infinite vault, which I beheld with interior vision. Why don't you go to sleep? Sir, how can I sleep in the presence of lightning, blazing, whether my eyes are shut or open? You are blessed to have this experience. The spiritual radiations are not easily seen. The saint added a few words of affection. This is the light that shineth in darkness. It has been described variously in the great scriptures. In the Bhagavad Gita, the chapter 11, the devotee Arjuna is given an experience of the infinite state and exclaims in awe, if there should rise suddenly within the skies sunbursts of 1,000 suns, flooding earth with beams of undeemed of, then might be that Holy One's majesty and radiance dreamed of. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
This reading is from Paramahansa Yogananda's book of mystical poems called Whispers from Eternity. This is the newly edited edition by Swami Kriyananda. With the opening of the earliest dawn and the lotus buds, my soul softly opens in prayer to receive thy light. Bathe each petal of my mind in thy radiant rays. I saturate myself with the perfume of thy presence, and I wait to waft with the breeze of the aroma of thy message, of thy love to all. Bless me, that with the spreading dawn I may spread thy love everywhere. Bless me, that with the awakening dawn I may awaken all souls with my own and bring them to thee. Well, today's topic is God present there even where there is ignorance? And I realized it was helpful to first think about what do we mean by ignorance? And I think in a practical sense, looking at it as human beings, that there's really two types of ignorance that we're talking about. One is a relative lack or absence of consciousness, and the other is a relative lack or absence of conscious. I've always felt that it's a beautiful way that the yogis have put it, that God, in fact, is in all things as a truism, but saying that God sleeps in the rocks and in material, inanimate matter, that although there is the consciousness of God, it's in a very quiescent state. And we see that when we come to humankind, that this consciousness is now awake. And in humankind, when the human becomes a great saint, that we see the true awakening of superconsciousness when the human becomes fully awake. You know, it's so interesting when you think that the yogis have talked about God in this way, the fact that he permeates all matter, that his consciousness is in everything. And that really it's only been in the last 100 years that in science we've realized that when we think about material substances, that in fact they're made of energy. Really, it's just been within the last 100 years that our understanding of atoms, rather than being like tiny billiard balls or tiny BBs that in themselves are solid, we understand now from modern particle theory that these seemingly solid, tiny microscopic particles are themselves made up of smaller vibrational units. I still remember when I was in medical school back in the mid-1970s when they discovered quarks. This was kind of a big deal because at that point we knew that electrons were so tiny that they had both solid and wave-like properties that you couldn't actually say where an electron, the tiny electron that whizzes around an atom, you couldn't really locate it at any given time. It wasn't really possible to do that because it was both a vibrational wave and this solid. It had characteristics of both. But we still had this idea that the nucleus of an atom was still this sort of solid thing made up of protons and neutrons. And it was at this point in the mid-1970s that they realized that in fact, protons and neutrons were themselves made up of smaller particles called quarks. Actually comes from literature, probably Prakash could tell us what this quote is from. It's from 3 Quarks for Muster Mark. I've always thought it's an English writer, and I've always taken that to mean, 3 hurrahs for Master Mark. But that's literally where the term comes from. Physicists have put a lot of humor in what they do. They also said that they described the characteristics of these really quite invisible particles that you can describe more mathematically than with anything that you can see. You can only really test them in high energy particle accelerators. They gave them characteristics like color and charm and up and down. They just, it was actually ways of describing them, but just showed this sense of humor in it all. I've always enjoyed how playful that was. But the thing that it really showed us, if there were any holdouts in the scientific community, that in fact all matter was made of energy, this was the breakthrough that showed if we have any thoughts that we're somehow this inanimate matter, we're really this seething vibrational sea of energy. And now there's this whole, really, it's kind of one of the mainstream areas in physics looking at what we would call string theory, that in fact these smaller particles like quarks and electrons are themselves made up of these tiny vibrating strings of energy. And it's, you know, when you read how string theory is described, it just flows so beautifully with the way the yogis have talked about energy and the nature of the material world. I've always thought it was interesting that even Yogananda had mentioned that countless lifetimes ago, he could actually remember his past lives. He actually remembered a lifetime where he was a diamond. So this idea of consciousness in all matter, in fact, it's for all of us will be our legacy when we are fully awakened, that we'll be able to remember all these different states and remember our consciousness as it flowed throughout history, gradually gaining greater and greater awareness. So this is one kind of ignorance where we're talking about really an absence or lack of conscious awareness to a relative degree. But there's one other kind of ignorance, and I'd say this is more the relative absence of conscience. And this applies more to human beings. This is where God's laws are really being actively opposed. I mean, there are so many examples of this. I think you can think of the death camps during World War II, where countless Jews and other undesirables were put to death and just treated in really horrific ways. And remember, the people who were running these camps, these were not political thugs. When the SS was first developed around Hitler, the SS was called the Schutzstaffel. And this was kind of the core of the German hierarchy. And it was made up of lawyers and brilliant intellectuals. So when you read about episodes in history like Kristallnacht, when all these German soldiers went out and were killing people, killing Jews, ruining their shops, all the terror that happened around that, these weren't political thugs that were doing it. This was the most intelligent cream of the culture at that time. They'd gotten drawn into this totally horrific way of thinking, and yet they'd been caught by it. And you can read the actual written recordings of conversations where they made decisions on how they were going to get rid of the undesirables throughout Eastern Europe. And again, these were not political thugs talking about something in a way that sounds like mafia hitmen. These are actually very intelligent people trying to figure out how, given our human conscience and conscience and our understanding of the law, how can we go ahead and do this? And somehow in their mind they'd figured this out, and they were able to talk about it very elegantly. I mean, it was a little horrifying in itself to read some of these things, because you can see how far away from God's purpose they'd become, and they were extremely intelligent people, and so they ended up being very effective in what they did. They were able to automate this horrific process. I did have one thought about this, though. I mean, I'm just using one example from World War II, but things are happening currently in this world that are just as awful, just as worrisome. But I was thinking the one thing that we do find in every situation like this, that you will find great saints in the midst of the most terrific horrors that are there to help those around them. I was just thinking this morning of giving Sunday service, and the thought occurred to me, I was actually thinking of Seva, but when I look out into the room here, I could see many of you that if we were caught in a horrific, hell-like circumstance like that, that we would be the leaders trying to comfort others, trying to help others, even though we knew that our demise was imminent as well, that we too would suffer and be killed. And there's many times in the history of spiritual development where we've seen where great saints have ended up having to suffer tremendously. I mean, Christ on the cross saying, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do," really offering his great love and compassion, even at the point of tremendous discomfort and pain. Another saint from early Christianity, one not quite as well known, his name was Saint Lawrence. And actually he existed in Christianity before Constantine. So this was before the Roman Empire had actually made Christianity its main religion. And so if you were a Christian, you could get killed for just being a Christian. And so the Romans apprehended him and decided they were going to put him to death. And they decided the way they would do this was to grill him. So they made this metal grill and they were put him on it over this fire, to kill him. And after a few minutes, they asked him how he was doing. And he looked up with this incredible beatific smile and said with great joy, "You know, fellows, I think I'm very well done on this side. It's time to flip me over." And that is what we see with those that are aware and awake in God, is God's joy becomes the reality. And outward circumstance, whether it's our relationships, whether it's our work situation, become less important to our day-to-day happiness. We realize that true happiness is an inward experience. The truth is that if you look at what motivates people's behavior in this world, and this has been true throughout history. I mean, if there's anything you can take from the lessons of history, is you can go back to the Roman Empire, you can go back to the Byzantine Empire, you can go to the Middle East in the 1500s, and human nature is human nature. It's the same as now. And what you see is everyone is seeking happiness. Their way of doing it may seem totally antithetical to actually being happy. You look at someone like a Genghis Khan or a Stalin, and in fact, Yogananda had said that Genghis Khan and Stalin were in fact the same soul in different incarnations. And I mean, these were truly horrific human beings. Both of them murdered tens of millions of people during their lifetime. In fact, Master once said that Stalin made Hitler look like a Boy Scout. Well, how could someone that horrific be seeking happiness? Well, when you really looked at the man's personality, at least when he was Stalin, because we have historical records about it, you can see so much was driven by his desire for power and his great fear and paranoia about those around him. And so his way of feeling safe and secure was to be this horrific person. He actually drove his wife to suicide. He berated her so much in a public talk that after the talk, she went home and committed suicide. So, and yet a Stalin, he was actually seeking happiness in his own way. Master actually said about this that, I mean, we're fortunate for all of us that God is greatly compassionate, that even someone like a Stalin will eventually find God. He may have to do a lot of tapasya to make up for the bad things that he's done, but that eventually he too will find God. And so it is for all of us that we need to remember that in this whole process of seeking happiness, since that's really the core of human nature, we need to stay focused on the things that we know will actually make us happy. Fortunately, I always think this is so helpful as devotees to see what science has to tell us about the actual studies that have been done on things like what makes people happy. In scientific terms, in medical terms, we call it positive affect. But really what we're talking about is what makes people happy. And what we can see is that for the vast majority of people, that their level of happiness stays about the same throughout their lifetimes. It sort of wobbles up and down in a surprisingly narrow band over an entire lifetime. And often people will have little bumps of happiness when a positive thing happens to them. You know, they enter a new relationship and there's this great romantic surge. They're in a new situation and there's great hope for the future. They inherit some money, something that's a very positive change for them. And basically what we see is people get about 6 months worth of happiness out of that. And then they start trickling back down to their same state that they were before this wonderful thing happened. And in fact, if you look at many people, what you can see in their lives is that they keep going through this cycle of about every 1 to 2 years, they strike out and try to do something new, looking for that 6 months of happiness. Because they know that if they change things externally, they may be happy for a while. But the conundrum is they never quite get that it's only good for 6 months and then they're right back to where they started. Also, these scientific studies have shown us that there are things that really change this baseline of happiness. In fact, this is, I found, a very interesting thing. If you go out through our planet and look at countries similar to our own here in the United States, you go to the Scandinavian countries or Europe or Britain, and compare the level of happiness in those countries to ours, what you find is it's about the same as here. The countries that have a little more freedom and are culturally less oppressive tend to be a little bit happier, and the ones that are more oppressive and more culturally restrictive, like the Japanese culture, tend to have a kind of lower level of baseline happiness, but it's surprisingly close when you just literally study tens and tens of thousands of people. Well, what about changing our baseline level of happiness, if that's really in human nature what people are seeking? Well, again, we've got scientific evidence that really corroborates our understanding of how things work spiritually. They've found that people that serve others and don't think about themselves actually are happier. And it's not a happiness that's temporary, it's a happiness that is persistent. We actually know there's a portion of the brain that becomes quiet when you're not thinking about yourself. And you actually feel happier and freer. I mean, I'm always happy to see that there's actual physiologic correlates in the brain to how these changes occur. Of course, this is the temptation, I think, for many who are trying to keep this all just strictly man is inanimate matter that just happened to sort of form itself into a human being, this very complex thing, which kind of defies all the laws of physics if you really think about it. You know, it's a little bit like one day your big pile of lumber decided to build you a shed by itself and paint itself. And that's a small process when you compare it to what it would take to make a human being or the kind of very complex systems we have on Earth. The other things that have been found to make a difference in baseline level of happiness are having religious practices, and as part of that, people who meditate or do an interiorizing practice. So we even have corroboration from science now that shows that a meditative practice, one that actually is integrated fully into a lifestyle of living for God and having God be the focus in our lives, that people, in fact, are actually happier. So if the goal of life, in terms of people's human behavior, in fact, is to seek happiness, we have not only the saints, but we even have the scientists that are looking at this more clinically saying, this is the thing that's been shown to work. You know, when I look at my medical practice, there's so many of my patients come in, and often they're in psychological extremis or crisis, and they're self-medicating with things like alcohol or other substances, hoping that it can at least decrease their pain some. It's not like they're trying to be happier, they're just trying to be in less pain. And the good news for everyone as a spiritual seeker is really the best way to work with this reality of a physical body and a physical world and culture that we have to interact with is to have an interior life. You know, God's been incredibly compassionate with all of us. We come into this world with a huge baggage full of karma, many, many lifetimes where we've done good things and many horrific things. I actually deliberately talked about a number of things that were, I would have to say, catastrophic and horrific in my talk today, and I did that deliberately because all of us should remember that probably at some point in the past, we were one of the people doing the horrible stuff. In fact, I found it so instructive that in World War II that the leading Nazis were not just these political thugs. Some of them were really brilliant people, terribly misguided, but in their own way, brilliant, well-educated, had every advantage in their life, and somehow had gotten off track. So I think for all of us to remember that when we look at these horrible things that have happened, yes, we've actually had them done to us, and frankly, we've probably done them. But our freedom is knowing that we don't have to be bound by that, that in the process of God realization, all our past karma is going to get burned up. It's one of the reasons that the masters have emphasized meditation as a way of quickening that process. You can actually just with right spiritual living over many, many hundreds of thousands of years, it's really 1,000,000 years is not an unreasonable figure to pick, that you can actually achieve realization just by right living. Well, it's much, much faster if you include a meditative process that includes devotion and really focuses on these ways of supercharging our spiritual search and eliminating those last vestiges, those last holds of old humiliations, old bits of anger, all the kind of psychological furniture and luggage and baggage that we carry along with us, that it all gets taken care of. That ignorance that all of us have, all of the things that are preventing us from being totally awake in God right now will eventually be eliminated. It's God's promise to us. I've always been greatly comforted by one thing that Yogananda said. He said, remember that Kriya Yoga is like mathematics. Kriya Yoga plus devotion will give you God realization. It works like mathematics. It will work for everyone. In fact, I was just thinking again today that it's sort of the ultimate in democratic equality, that anyone from any background can become a great saint through being a yogi, by wanting to develop themselves and to be spiritually a superhuman being. And it's open to any of us. You don't have to worry who your parents were, what your background was, what kind of a person you were before you got onto the spiritual path. The question is the future. And usually when I talk to people about spiritual development, the real questions I look at is not what happened 20 years ago. I mean, I've seen this before in talking to people that are depressed or upset, and you'll realize they're really mad at somebody from something that happened 20 years ago, that person's dead. They're not even around anymore and they're still mad at them. Well, what are you going to do with that? It's not like you can go find them and yell at them, and yet their lives are miserable because they still carry this hurt and anger. And so it is that a technique like Kriya Yoga, or our meditation techniques that we do, are one way of actually taking these old psychological quirks that all of us have and working with them and eventually eliminating them. And in that process of that elimination, of roasting those seeds of past karma, we actually free up that energy for joy and to be awake in God. It's one of the reasons that great saints always appear so transparent and so sweet and loving and are people of tremendous power. It's because they've burned up all the baggage. Everything that was sort of restricting them and constricting them, giving them these neurotic behavior patterns, it's kind of gone. And so this tremendous inner flow of joy and energy is just there. In some ways, in fact, Master talked about this. He said that when you're fully realized, it's kind of hard to have a personality because you're so transparent. You know, you don't have likes and dislikes that normally would be the eccentricities that color a person's behavior, that you're so free that when you're with people, it's just to serve. There's no thought of I, me, mine. What about things for my family? What about things for the people that matter to me? Everything is God. Everything that happens is for God. It's all God serving God. I think to end today, what I would just say is that I think for all of us, we should remember that the most important thing to be thinking about right now is what are we going to do to continue to grow spiritually as we're moving forward. We can't change what the past is like. We can't change what happened a year ago, but we can change a lot where we will be in the next 3 months or 6 months by what we start doing right now. So if your meditation practice has slipped or you've not been thinking about God as much as you should, this is a time to renew that inner vow of, I'm here because I want to be a Yogi Christ. I'm here because I want to be like Master or Saint Francis or Jesus Christ. And remember, that is a legacy that is open to any of us. None of us are barred from that. It is really a question of our willingness to offer ourselves. God is there as a willing helpmate in this. The masters are there as a willing helpmate in this. And really all they're waiting is for us to say, I'm not interested in being upset about something from 20 years ago or something that my coworker is doing to me right now. What I want is, I want God realization. And as soon as we do that, then all the past, all the hurt, everything just begins to blur away and we become more awake in God and ourselves become Yogi Christs.